What is up, y'all? This is the History Zone podcast with Zane Rosler. I hope y'all had a wonderful Juneteenth because that is going to be the theme for today's podcast. Just a reminder, Juneteenth is the celebration of emancipation in the United States. On June 19th, 1865, Union troops came down to Galveston, Texas, and told the enslaved people that they were finally free. For this episode, we're going to bring it back to South Carolina. In other words, how did the enslaved people in South Carolina learn that they were finally free? It's worth noting that for as long as slavery has existed in South Carolina, the enslaved people have always tried to liberate themselves. One of the most notable happening before the United States existed as a separate country, the Stono Rebellion, where a bunch of slaves tried to escape to Spanish Florida. Unfortunately, that one was suppressed. There were many slave rebellions that happened after the establishment of the United States. One in South Carolina was started by Denmark Vesey, but unfortunately that didn't go anywhere until he was tried and found guilty. And one notable one that happened in Virginia started by Nat Turner, which did end up killing people. That ended up making slavery more stringent in Virginia in particular and the South in general. And slavery would continue to divide the antebellum country. One example was in Bleeding, Kansas. In 1854, they tried something new called popular sovereignty. This would be the practice where, for a new state to be established, the people would decide whether or not they would allow slavery. Unfortunately, this led to a lot of pro-slavery and a lot of anti-slavery settlers to try to flood the Kansas territory. This would lead to an outbreak of violence that lasted almost 5 years. Another clash would happen in the fall of 1859. This was led by a man named John Brown, who was on a crusade to end slavery in the United States. He led a raid in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, because he wanted to arm the slaves of the South and start a rebellion. John Brown and his party were stopped by the Marines, and John Brown himself was soon executed for what he did. But this didn't faze Brown much, as he was willing to become a martyr in the cause of ending slavery. News of John Brown's raid and execution made waves all around the country, and it showed a sign that there was a growing appetite for the abolition of slavery. This frightened many people across the South, especially those families whose fortunes was built off the back of enslaved labor. The final nail in the coffin was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, the views on Lincoln and slavery were a bit complicated. Near 1860, he did what most politicians did, and that is use a bunch of language to try to placate and pacify everyone and get as much support as he possibly could. However, his lack of enthusiastic desire to expand slavery was radical enough for a bunch of southern states to not even put him on the ballot as the Republican candidate. Despite many southern states refusing to have him as a candidate, he still won the election of 1860. This was the final straw for South Carolina, who on Christmas Eve of 1860 had decided to secede from the Union. Soon, several other states would follow in South Carolina's steps and started to secede, where they would form the Confederate States of America. And in April of 1861, forces from the new CSA decided to fire on Union forces in Fort Sumter off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, starting the American Civil War. And this is when our story of emancipation in South Carolina actually begins. In November of 1861, less than a year after the Civil War began, Union forces managed to win a battle in Port Royal, South Carolina, off the coast of Beaufort. These would begin what are known as the Sea Island experiments in Union-occupied territory off the coast of South Carolina. Through Union support and patronage from many benefactors in the Northeast, people in the Sea Islands were beginning to experiment with what was at the time very radical notions of black citizenship. One of them was through black land ownership. As the name implies, they believed that black people who had been previously forced to till the land of rich slave owners should be able to own some of their own, and they started small scale on the Sea Islands off South Carolina. This had limited results in the long term. Even though it was limited to only a few black families who managed to pass down land from generation to generation, it did give the other black people a taste for what they deserved as future citizens of the United States. Another part of the Port Royal experiment was education. This radical notion arguably had a larger impact, for its influences surpassed the Civil War and gave something that many enslaved people were denied for centuries: education and literacy. This led to an influx of Northerners, educators, and missionaries to the Sea Islands of South Carolina. Unfortunately, this experiment was cut short. One main reason is that this was mostly funded by patronage, and a lot of the will and money to fund the Sea Island experiment ran out. It also didn't help that George McClellan, the then commander of the Union Army at the time, needed people to reinforce further up the peninsula and away from the Sea Islands. Despite its short success, the Sea Island experiments would lead to the influences of the Freedmen's Bureau after the war. But that leads us to another story of emancipation in South Carolina. As Union armies were trying to occupy and take over the South, they needed people who knew the land and knew the places. Fortunately, there was a subsection of men in South Carolina who were sympathetic to the Union cause and could fill these roles perfectly: the formerly enslaved people. After the Battle of Port Royal, a Massachusetts abolitionist turned Union officer named Thomas W. Higginson decided to form a regiment of freedmen. Most higher-ups in the Union Army thought that black people and freedmen could only be used for menial tasks and menial labor and leave the fighting up to the white men. Higginson saw things a little differently. For Higginson, he saw a bunch of men who were more than willing to take up arms and liberate the families that the Confederate officers held in bondage. With a bunch of rifles, 3 gunboats of questioning condition, and formerly enslaved people, Higginson had the force he needed to form the South Carolina 1st Regiment. This seemed like a Herculean task alongside trying to reform a bunch of formerly enslaved people and train them to be disciplined soldiers. The reputation of any future black soldiers in the Union Army would rest on the success of those in the South Carolina 1st Regiment. Their first main combat mission would be to liberate the eastern parts of Florida and the Sea Islands of Georgia. There were a lot of mechanical issues with the gunboats, and the CSA were hiding and ready. Fortunately, the South Carolina 1st Regiment were able to bring victory to the Union Army and show that they were fierce fighters. Their performance and bravery showed that the black people in the Union Army were just as good as fighters as any white man. Basically, the 1st South Carolina Regiment walked so that future and more well-known regiments like the 54th Massachusetts could fly. This leads to the third story of liberation in South Carolina, which involves the General William Tecumseh Sherman. It's worth noting beforehand that in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which said that any slave in rebellious territory was now liberated. This meant that when the Union came to town, all the enslaved people were finally free. Then we skip to the second half of 1864. By then, Abraham Lincoln was running for re-election, and his chances were not looking so good because the Civil War wasn't going so well. Not to mention that his former general, George McClellan, was running against him and was running on a platform of negotiating with the CSA. Lincoln really needed something flashy to inspire hope not only in his campaign, but the war in general. That is where General Sherman comes into play. General Sherman decided that the Civil War needed to be a total war, and he decided to do a scorched earth project. This meant that anything that economically funded the CSA was fair game. This led many of his troops to attack the plantation system that had funded the CSA for generations, and the one that the CSA was hoping would lead to foreign intervention on their behalf. This meant his troops ended up burning fields, destroying tools, and most importantly for this episode, liberating the slaves that had worked on these plantations. This was the war policy that Sherman used in his march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah. The success of this campaign not only helped Abraham Lincoln win re-election, but it also caused a massive blow into the morale of CSA soldiers. This would also be the policy that Sherman used when he decided to march up north and capture Columbia. This meant in South Carolina, he not only burned the plantations as he did in Georgia, but he liberated the slaves who had been waiting for Union soldiers to come. His scorched earth policy finally reached Columbia, where he burned around 2/3 of the buildings there. And by February 17, 1865, the CSA General Johnston had surrendered to William Tecumseh Sherman. South Carolina was finally in Union hands. From there, the Union would finally reach the CSA rear in Virginia, where in the spring of that year, Robert E. Lee finally surrendered, ending the Civil War. And in December of that year, the 13th Amendment will be signed, ending the chattel slavery that had defined the Southern system for generations. That is where our story will end for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, like, subscribe, and hit the bell and help the channel grow. The History Zone was a production made possible thanks to the Richland Downtown Library in Columbia, South Carolina. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you in the next one.